All right, well, thank you all so much for joining. We have not met. My name is Kelly. I serve as the president of the Harvard Business School Club of Colorado, which has the purpose of creating community among our alumni in Colorado, Harvard Business School, and local business community. So our special guest for today is Ed Hajim. Ed has an incredible story of surviving a childhood kidnapping and living in orphanages and foster homes to becoming a highly influential and successful Wall Street executive. So he shares his story in his book, On the Road Less Traveled, An Unlikely Journey from the Orphanage to the Boardroom. If you haven't read it yet, I have. It's fantastic. I definitely recommend it. And he has a second book planned to come out in the spring. And so for this session, if you remember to please mute yourselves, and then if you want to ask a question, go ahead and ask or raise your hand, or you can put your question in the chat. So Joe, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. And just as a reminder, if you haven't already gotten it, you should. I loved reading your book, Ed. It brought a lot of insight into what early in your career was parts of your life that you kept fairly private. So I'd love to be able to, for the group to just hear some of the pivotal experiences you had early on that shaped the sort of person that you are today.
It's very. I've come to the conclusion after writing the book and I'm thinking about my life that many disadvantages that you have as a youngster end up being advantages. And you know, when I talk to Horatio Alger kids, all have pretty much worse backgrounds than I do. I always kid them and saying, you know, you're really lucky. They all look at me like I'm crazy. That having those difficult experiences makes you ready to handle some of life's difficult situations. Mm-hmm. And even I tell my well-to-do friends who basically have kids that grow up in, like my children did in Greenwich, Connecticut, and go to one school their whole life, that basically you have to make your children uncomfortable. You have to give them Outward Bound or Knowles, or make them work in the summertime, so that early in their lifetime they have failures and difficulties and so forth. So later on in life, when those things emerge again, you know, they can handle them. So let's take my life, you know,
or exposing them to Ed Hajim early.
There you go. That's good. Even looks like you a little.
Thank you.
Where are you, by the way? Looks like you're in a library. Or is that just the backdrop?
Yeah, this is the Dartmouth Library in the background, but I'm just virtually there.
You're beautiful. Anyway, my father was a immigrant, and in the first 29 years of his life, he was very successful. You'll see the pictures in the book with him, his own airplane. He had buildings on 110th Street, New York City. He had a big portfolio. He went to work for RCA and was a nut on technology, the radio at the time. In 2933, lost everything, literally everything, and picked up the demons of failure, as I call them. And basically, as he told me the story, he said, I had to decide between committing suicide and driving to California, where the streets were paved with gold. Of course, lucky for me, he decided to drive to California. On the way to California, he stopped at a distant cousin's home. The distant cousin had 6 children, and shockingly, he fell in love, or I don't know what happened, but he married the 5th of the 6 children. She was 18 years old, 15 years his junior, and they proceeded on to California. When they got there, the streets were not paved with gold, and I was born 3 years later, and on my birth certificate it said, to a unemployed father and homemaker mother. Not only did my father have what I call failure demons, he also had a mentality of being a Middle Eastern tyrant. If you read Leon Uris's book, The Hajj, he was Abraham. He believed he was the king of the walk. He had very unusual eating habits, and he treated women that, you know, as servants. My mother put up with that for another 3 years. He also had trouble keeping a job. It was a depression, but he was a difficult character, a good person, but he basically had very bad breaks. And in 39, she filed for divorce. He didn't even show up at the ceremony. And she got full custody of me, and he got $5 a week of alimony and child support and visiting rights on Sunday. And she immediately took me from Los Angeles, where we were living, to St. Louis, where her family was looking. And her family didn't welcome her. It was 1939, and no one needed 2 more mouths to feed. My dad showed up a month or so later for his first visit, and instead of taking me to the park or the movie, he jumped back on Highway 66. And you'll see the front of the book. It's he and I in a car driving the 1,800 miles back to Los Angeles. On the way, he called my mother and said, don't look for us. And he shouldn't. He threatened her, actually. Subsequently, he told me my mother had died. And I believed that for 57 years. And that's one of those secrets in the book. I'll come to that later on. And he and I lived together for 2 years. He was a merchant marine. The radio turned into radio operator and ended up as a radio operator aboard a ship. So he was out of town at least half the time. And I stayed with neighbor ladies. When he was in town, we stayed in hotels and motels. That ended completely when the war started in 1941. He was either drafted or volunteered for the Merchant Marines and became an officer in the Merchant Marines. I got put into the Catholic welfare system. And over the next 5 years, I was in 5 different foster homes, which varied from cold and abusive, which was the longest one, to warm and caring, which was the shortest one. It was the last one that I was in. It was a great experience because I ended up in 5 different schoolyards at 5 different schools. And I always say that if you look at that, if you can get through 2 or 3 schoolyards in your youth, you learn how to get through almost anything. Because entering a new schoolyard when you're a young kid, it's a tough deal. So after the war ended, he wanted to reunite. I flew across country somehow all by myself on a DC-10, a 5-stopper from Los Angeles to New York. I got there about 5 hours late. Dad was unhappy, so it was not a great reunion, even though we hadn't seen each other in 5 years. That summer we spent in the YMCA on 34th Street, a place where the clientele left a little bit to be desired, but I ended up learning the subway system while my father looked for land-based work. In September, we transferred to a hotel in Coney Island. I went to the local school, did pretty well. It wasn't a bad year for me. Terrible year for my father. Couldn't find land-based work, went back to sea. In fact, the funny part of the story was in the latter part of that summer, a woman decided she would take me, I would stay with her. And she decided to change her mind at the last minute, said she couldn't take me until school started. So he turned to me and said, here's some money, eat at the delicatessen and stay out of trouble, and left for a ship. And I stayed by myself for about 30 or so plus days. Come September, she decided she didn't want me at all. I guess I was undesirable or something. Anyway, so Dad from the ocean, which is really, my father was in a unique sort of character. He got me into an orphanage, a Jewish orphanage in Far Rockaway. And there I traded in my hotel room and my private bathroom for a room with 50 guys in it. And you kept all your stuff underneath your bed in a single drawer, and traded my bathroom for a room with 10 sinks and 10 toilets and 10 shower heads. But when I got to the orphanage, I got something I never had before, which was community and consistency. I was part of a group. And basically the kids went to a very fine local public school, and I flourished at that particular case. Things were going on pretty well. Then I started to age out of that orphanage, and my father disappeared on me. Disappeared when I was about 14 years old, which was 1950. And basically, I didn't find out why he disappeared until 2015. And that's a very long story, and it's in the book. But anyway, I became a ward of the state. And, the young social worker lady could have put me any place, into a reform school or any other damn thing. But she put me into a second orphanage where instead of having 50 boys in the room, we only had 3. And it was 4 blocks from a wonderful public school. And I then, actually, the moment I arrived there in the beginning of my sophomore year, I looked at around about 80% of the kids went to private colleges, and I realized my ticket out of my situation was a private college. And so I put my head down. I became an athlete. I did well in math and science. And at the end of my trip, I took every scholarship. There weren't that many scholarships that time, but I did get the NROTC scholarship, which changed my life. I mean, there were only 1,200 kids across the country that got the scholarship. I barely weighed enough. You had to weigh 125 pounds. And I weighed 122 pounds. And that morning of the physical, I ate 3 pounds of bananas so I could get up if I didn't make it. And the corpsman who took my weight said, all right, we'll throw a pound on there. I said, thank you very much. And I got through. So I decided to go to the University of Rochester because I wanted to go to Cornell or RPI, but both of them said NROTC students have to take 5 years because you have to take naval science courses. Rochester said, I never heard of Rochester. One of the principal of my high school recommended it. He said, it's a good school. So, those days you took your chances. I went up to Rochester, and of course, they didn't tell me the whole truth because I ended up being in 6 8 o'clock classes for 4 years. And I was in a laboratory every afternoon. And in my junior year, I had to take a 3-week summer course to get through, but we got through. First year was ugly. You know, I arrived on campus with my suitcase of the wrong clothes and a black leather jacket. And I watched all the kids get out of their cars with their parents. And so my euphoria lasted about 2 hours. And then, of course, the first week of college in those days was fraternity rushing, which in those days was the key to get into a fraternity. And I was rejected by every fraternity on campus. But I bought a tweed jacket, cut my hair, played basketball, freshman basketball, freshman baseball. And the second year, everything turned around. And I had a very fine 4 years. Ended up graduating as a chemical engineer with a couple of gold bars on my shoulders. And so I was on my way. That's the beginning. That's the story. And it's a story that basically says these disadvantages I had became advantages. Let's take them one at a time. First of all, adaptability. If you in your first 18 years, you're in 15 or 20 different places the way I was, probably more, you get adaptable. You gain adaptability. You actually seek change because you're pretty good at it. I say you go from one schoolyard to the next, and then you travel across country. You go to a totally different environment. You're in a YMCA, and you got to deal with lots of unsavory characters. Or you're living in Coney Island, where the streets weren't like they are today. You learn to adapt, and it really took me through my business career. I was always never afraid of change. When you'll see my job at EF Hutton, I said the president's going the wrong direction. I'm going to change firms, and in my own incarnation, when I became the CEO, I put change in as the most important thing we did. Every year, we always asked, what's next? And we always made a change in the firm. Now, when I manage the golf club the same way, I say, our members want something new every year. In addition, you gain resilience. You go through some tough times. The first family I was with were awful. I mean, I wasn't Cinderella, but they didn't treat me well at all. And I was always an outsider. So you gain resilience, and resilience is like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger you get. And I got pretty strong. You get perseverance because you go through one or two of these things, and you gain self-confidence. You start to get an inner voice that says you can do it. So these disadvantages become advantages. Even some of the negative things that I did acquire that stayed with me a while, like anger. When you go through these situations, and if you're a mentor to some of these kids, you'll realize they're all angry because you constantly ask yourself, why me? Why am I in this orphanage? Why am I, why can't I have the right clothes? I never learned to ride a bicycle or swim because the pool at the orphanage was only 3 feet deep. They didn't have any bicycles. So I played basketball and baseball because they did that. But I didn't learn that. I didn't learn culture. I had to go back and start over again in music and art, things like that. Became angry. Well, somewhere early on, actually in the Navy, I started to convert this anger into, instead of taking it externally on outside people, blaming people, I started to basically use it to drive myself. And then what happened to me was I created something which I want to pass on to everybody, and it's hard to do, but never be a victim. And you'll find out, you read my book, I had, sometimes it's my fault, sometimes it's the other guy's fault, but I was never a victim. I always accepted what happened and used my energy instead of being a victim, and that takes a lot of energy, being your energy of figuring out what's next. At Lehman Brothers, I spent 7 years. I did, and I'll be unbashful. I did everything right. I changed one division, which was out of business, into a profitable activity. They threw me in the backwater of the firm. I raised $7.5 billion, made their money management company one of the most profitable parts of the business. They still kicked me out. I could have fought them. And I might have won because I had outside boards that were beholden to me, threw it all in. And then I got my dream job of being a CEO and a chairman of a small investment bank. So all through your life, golf club. I got rejected by the only golf club in Nantucket. I don't know why. I knew everybody there. I was also a trustee of a university, and we were involved in local charities. They said no. So I went out and built my own golf club, and that basically, use your energy, and it takes a lot, but it's what's next. So these things are very important. Now, when I say to people, so what? What does that mean to me? I ask you to take your genes and your background and put them together. In other words, if you look at mom and dad and grandpa and Uncle Harry and Aunt Matilda, a bunch of mix like that, then you take, are you the only child? Are you the number 6 out of 10? Did you have one school? Did you go to 18 places like I? Put those two together, you find out who you are and how you make decisions. Right. And that's really very, very important. Now, I gained that by looking back at my life and figuring some of the wrong decisions I made because of my background, and some of the right decisions, some of the things that really helped me because of my background. Because of my background, by the way, I can associate with almost anybody. I interview someone no matter what they've done, I've probably been there, done that, because most people grow up in Greenwich, Connecticut, like my kids. Unfortunately, they don't have an association with people who have very great difficulty. I had to go through all these different experiences. So that's sort of a long answer to a short question. My daughter has criticized me. She's a curator for TED Talks. I always answer the question too long. So Joe, stop.
No, that was really good, Ed. And I got a really good flavor in your words in terms of how your experiences shaped you, sort of the non-traditional background, the resilience you built, but the succeeding academically in a rigorous discipline, and socially discovering that what you loved most was managing people. How would you describe your leadership style, taking those experiences into account?
Well, that's in the book, you'll find out something about exercising your passions or finding your passions. Let me just talk about passions. Most passions are formed, and you can flash back on this, but in high school, sort of, you get there, if you no longer want to be an astronaut or a fireman, you decide in your high school, my passions were math and science, baseball and basketball, and girls. And some people would say probably there was a reverse order. But anyway, when I went to college, those all morphed. Engineering, math and science morphed into engineering and then chemical engineering. Baseball and basketball morphed after my freshman year when I realized that I wasn't going to be a professional athlete. I did play freshman baseball and basketball, did pretty well. But I decided to take intramural sports and then extracurricular activities, which I get very busy on. And then I wouldn't think about my background, because I buried my background. I wouldn't tell anybody where I came from. I didn't want any special privileges from having been in an orphanage. I was ashamed of my background. Anyway, so I got busy. I became one of the editors of the yearbook. I was the business manager of the Dramatic Society, which had to fill the auditorium every Saturday night. I was the chairman of the Engineering Council. I was even the chairman of the Finance Board, which gave out all the money to all the activities. I was social chairman of my fraternity, which is one of the hardest jobs I've ever had. You have to provide that thing every Saturday night or they beat you up. And then I, of course, was in student government, one of 15 people in student government. The big thing I did was in my junior year, I somehow crazy taking organic and physical chemistry. I got this bug about producing a humor magazine like the Harvard Lampoon. And so I put 30 people together, and the president was against it, and the provost was against it, and the librarian was against it, and a bunch of deans were against it. But I was going to do this. And what I found is I love putting people together to solve a problem, putting people together to basically create a product, putting people together to create a program. And that's what really excited me. But inside that, my real passion was helping people do better than they thought they could. That's my management style. If people feel, and I didn't recognize this probably until maybe 15 years later. I didn't, that moment in time, I go, whoa, oh boy, voila, I found it. No, I found it later on. I was wondering why I did so well in certain businesses I was in it, because people felt, a couple of people said, Ed, you really are interested in me. You want me to do better. And then I morphed that into a very important, I collected principles all my life. One of the principles I fit right onto that was you can do almost anything if you don't care who gets the credit. So merge those two things, helping people do better than they thought they could, and then not willing to take the credit and go one step further. As I got older, I started to deflect credit. I have some fun sometimes. When someone says, Joe, you did a great job, the first thing you do is say, no, Mary Kelly was one who did it. She really did most of it. I did a little, yeah, but she did most of it. Three things happen. First of all, the person asking the question feels really good, that you're really a good guy. You feel good by saying it, and then Kelly feels good. So I started to deflect credit. When I was the president of the Alumni Association at Harvard Business School, they were going to give me a day because we really did quite well during my reign. And what I did that day was to take and make a video of the Associate Dean of External Relations, Christine Fairchild. And I showed that video the day when it was my day. And I did the same thing at the Chairman Board of Trustees of Rochester. Well, they tried to give me a day, and I pushed it out to the people there. So that's my management style. And it wouldn't make any difference whether you're managing and making widgets or, in my case, finance. If you're really interested in people doing better there's nothing better than having surrounded people doing better than they were supposed to do. Think about that. If you got people that are basically achieving more than they thought they could, you're in pretty good shape. And that's contagious. So that's what I call culture. You have to, when you're a business person, you have to create, culture is the most important thing, even more important than strategy in some case. I always say culture eats strategy. If you got a good culture, you can almost overcome anything, even somewhat of a faulty strategy. But that was my management style, and I still do that. I did that both, and I had a great opportunity later on in life to do that at an educational institution, the University of Rochester. My biggest company had 800 people, was $500 million. Rochester was 4 billion with 30,000 employees. So, I managed a company with 3 people, as you'll see, with hedge fund, all the way to 800 people, and now 30,000. Chancing, molding that strategy for each one of these different experiences was very important. And I think you have to sort of every once in a while think about, no matter what your business strategy is, it also depends upon the context. You manage 3 people different than 30 people, than 300 people, than 3,000 people. And you have to keep mobile. And that, but the one major element to me was this idea to ask someone what he wants to do and try to have them exceed their own expectations. So that's sort of a long answer against your short question.
Right. Let's pull on that thread a little bit, Ed. How do you set up others to succeed when the environment might not necessarily be conducive to it? And I think back at your experiences at Lehman Brothers, where you sort of, you joined at a time when there was a lot of infighting and there was not a whole lot of support. And you somehow managed to grow the securities business 500%. How do you sort of share, the things you talked about, sharing credit, elevating others, when it looks like at every decision you made was undermined in a different direction? How do you stop yourself from sort of, throwing up your hands or, potentially being one of the bad guys that you played with? How do you sort of keep your good guy hat on?
Well, again, it's a combination of that history of having a really, Lehman Brothers was bad, but it wasn't as bad as being in a foster home. It wasn't as bad as being in an orphanage, So actually, and also I had been in tough situations and I was successful. And so therefore, Lehman Brothers was very difficult. But, I was successful because I basically focused on the people working with me and for me. And I had, you really have, Doug, and you have a feel for this. I had people coming to me and saying the same thing you just said. Ed, how can you keep optimistic? Glucksman is destroying everything we're doing. But I kept saying, let's go, because there was no really alternative. Yeah. Either I had to throw in the towel, which, my wife wanted me many times during the 7 years. She said, it's not a good place. But I felt that it was a great experience because there were other parts of Lehman Brothers which were fantastic. I mean, some of the people there, George Ball, Undersecretary of State, he sent me to China. I mean, I was a partner of the firm. I was one of the board of directors. He sent me to China, and the chairman of the Bank of China picked me up in the airport. It took me to a dinner and so forth. Pete Peterson, who I worked with on a couple of deals, and then he would have the Federal Reserve chairman on hold doing a deal. So there was other parts of him. Steve Schwarzman, who now is a multi-billionaire. Steve was a junior partner at the time, and I watch him work as magic. He was there. I tell my favorite story of all time is Mario D'Orso. Mario was our Italian partner. He calls me one day, Zed, I got to find out about the economy. I said, Mario, where are you? It sounds funny in the background. He says, I'm on the Pope's plane. So, there was some good parts of Lehman Brothers, right. And the best dining room in the world. I mean, the food was off the charts, and you look at the dinner menu that they had the King of Spain, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, president of General Motors were all having dinner there. So it was a big prestige point for me, Ed Hajim, kid from the orphanage, and I was the not the youngest partner, I think, but the youngest member of the board of directors in 25 years. So there was a lot of prestige involved in it. And I had 2 offices there. One overlooked the harbor, then up the river. So it was a pretty good deal. And I had good cigars too. So there were some pluses in the thing. And I must say, I always felt that I could turn it around. I could change Glucksman. And that was a mistake that I made. After 7 years, I was wrong. But I always felt that I did a really good job. And there was one point in time when he did fire me, and when we merged with Kuhn Loeb, and he came back and said, no, I'm wrong. You're better than he was. Well, I found out from other people, he hated the other guy more than me. But I thought I turned him, but he was unturnable. And of course, after I left, 7 months later, the firm was gone. He wrecked the firm. and they had sold to Shearson for a song. So, but but I say, I don't believe there's any good in the middle of the war to do anything but go forward. Now, I did stop at the end of 3 years at the money management company. Said this is over. I believe in basically taking a 2 or 3 year picture of whatever you're going to do, work your tail off, and if you want, go to the beach, walk up and down the beach, and say, this is no good. Then you're out of there. And I did that at Hutton. Hutton, I mean, I loved Bob Foreman, unlike Lou Glucksman, but Bob was going the wrong direction. He wanted to stay in retail. I said, Bob, the future is institutional banking. He said, no, retail, that's our business. 90% of our profit. Now, John, you don't understand. Tomorrow it's going to be institutional. So I walked down, I went to the beach and on a boat and took a walk, and I said, just can't stay here because the guy is not going to make it. And of course, Hutton lasted a few more years, but 5 or 6 years later, they were gone because they stayed in that business. So that's the reason. And I think that's what I recommend to people. If you get into something really tough, stay with it for a period of time because you can win. I almost did win. I mean, I came close. There was a possibility that I might have run Lehman Brothers. That would have been fabulous, but it didn't happen. When he threw Peterson out, there was a little gap there that they were looking around. Glucksman just grabbed it, and that's life. But anyway, not being a victim, I got my dream job where I'm actually more qualified to run a small investment bank than I was really qualified to run Lehman Brothers. I might not have been qualified because I'm not that much of an external person. And again, these are the kinds of things you have to deal with yourself. Who are you? And I must say, I even considered it and said, I'm not Peterson. Peterson would go out, 4 nights a week in a suit, tuxedo, and go to places that I didn't want to go to. I don't want to spend 4 nights in my tuxedo. And that's what he had to do because he could basically call anybody up and get a piece of business. He's a wonderful businessman. Long answer, short question, Joe.
Really great stories. I'm going to pause here for a second and let others get in with some questions of their own.
Be mean. Get your questions answered, please.
Yeah, and I have a question. So, growing up, say in your first 18 years or before you went to college, let's say, how did you? So there was no default set of values that was instilled in you. How the way people who grew up in a more sheltered environment would. So you had to basically judge for yourself what are values they want to pick up and not, and so there must have been an operating system in place to do that based on what? And that's the question. Like, how did you put together your own, operating system to filter the values that you want to instill in yourself, and then how do you pick those up and kind of piece together the person you became?
That's an excellent question because it's something I struggle with, and I'm glad I wrote my book because I clarified much about that. First of all, I start off with a pretty good set of genes. Dad was a technical person. He was very good in radio in his day, and later on, I discovered my mom. She was a very sensible person, so it was a reasonable set of genes. And then recognized I wasn't in bad foster homes, at least not until the last one, but I did go to something called a Catholic school. And the nuns made it very simple. You learned the golden rule or you got the golden ruler. And sometimes they gave you the golden ruler, even though they gave you the golden rule, and they threw in the 10 commandments anyway. And they also, ages 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, they said, here's the path. You go on this path, you get to the good place someplace. Here you go on this path, you get to the other place. In other words, kids need structure and order. And even though, it may or may not have been true, I believe that if I was a good person, I would end up in heaven. And if I wasn't a good person, I would end up over here. And, and if you stepped out of line, they really made you understand that you were out of line. That was the first step. Second thing is the big key thing in a kid's life in my day was going to movies on Saturday. And on Saturday, you went to the movies and there were heroes. And the only thing they did wrong is at the end of every movie, they always smoked a cigarette before they died. But they John Wayne, Jimmy Stewart, Clark Gable, they were all good people. They did good things and they always won. So you got to sort of a hero worship there, where on a Saturday afternoon during your recreation, you got this role model. And then of course I have to give my father credit. He abandoned me like 3 times in the first 18 years. And as I studied the whole thing, I understand it. It wasn't his fault. He was dealt a really bad hand. And he gave me the one thing you really need. That's why I'm big on mentoring and counseling. He gave me unconditional love. He basically would send me letters and say, "You're the greatest." In fact, there's a letter in my book showing you, I said, "I'm really not that good a boy. Sometimes I'm a bad boy." He would not agree with that. "You're a good boy. You're the best. You're going to be very successful." And he would send messages like, "Cleanliness is next to godliness. Always associate with good people. Work hard. Dress well." And he would send me these messages, even though he was not there. And when he was there, he's very stern about me being, never struck me, but he could just look at me and make me unhappy because if I didn't dress well, if I didn't eat well, he was that kind of person. He was a vegetarian, which was crazy in those days. One of his problems was he had very unusual habits. He was a vegetarian. He was a nut on being clean and organized and so forth. So I had those three sort of pillars: the Catholic Church, movies, and my father, and they built the operating system. And then getting to this high school in Yonkers, New York, where 80% of the kids came from really good homes, I started to assimilate that. And I had a couple of girlfriends. Some of the mothers would not let their daughters date kids from the home, but I had a couple of girlfriends during that period, wonderful young ladies that really took me in, because they knew I was from the home. I took them out on a date on the bus and so on and so forth. And they conveyed to me some of the operating systems, as you call them. I never heard it. I'll have to use that. But an operating system, basically, that added to my operating system. These kids were conditioned, to go to high school and go to a private college and succeed. So I was in that group. Now, the orphanage had, about 5 kids per class. So there's only 5 of us in the orphanage. And we were athletes. I was on the basketball team and the baseball team and so forth. And these young ladies, really kind of took me underneath the wings. 3 or 4 of them during the 2.5-year period. Some of them actually be friends. In fact, one just discovered me. She's 86 years old. She's in Oregon someplace. She read my book and came back. And she was a big, tall girl. So there was no romantic relationship. But she was, really took my side. And really, we talked a lot and it really worked. So that's some of the things. And then a lot of luck. I mean, I could have gone to form school, been associated with a lot of bad kids and so forth. But I was in a place where most of the kids were pretty good kids. Wasn't the greatest thing in the world. Orphanages have a rites of passage, which are not very pleasant. So you have to find your spot on who you can beat up and who beats you up and sort of take that position. But the orphanage also had a headmaster or a guy who was terrific. He tried to mentor me and I wouldn't be mentored because I didn't trust anybody. But I look back at even though I rejected him, he gave me some of what you call operating systems. And he was absolutely behind me going to a private college. And most of the kids didn't. In the orphanage, they either went to work or went to local public college or CCNY or NYU or something. I had to get out of that syndrome so I could hide my background, put it away for 65 years until I wrote this book. Basically put that away because that way I could then assimilate without anybody telling me that, "Oh, we're doing you a favor." And so that I was ashamed. And I also didn't want any special consideration because of that. Because you really want what you're doing when you're in that syndrome, like I was into, you really want to find out who you are. The only way you find out who you are is to be kind of, not have a background where people say, "Wow," Anyway, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you.
If you look at your own background, you'll find out that there were certain kind of pillars. In fact, I was at this Catholic school yesterday, and as I talked about the nuns, I saw all the lights go on. Although I don't have nuns anymore, but all the lights go on with the kids that I was talking to because they were all drilled in the idea, you got to be a good person or else. Thanks.
Interesting. Thanks.
Ed, can I ask you a question? You talked earlier about one of the ways you managed people was you didn't take credit for anything. You passed it off and so on and so forth. And that made you a good leader. I'm trying to figure out how a bunch of MBAs on Wall Street are, who are fresh out of business school are giving away credit for all the things they did.
Oh, no, that's why most guys on Wall Street, by the way, are not managers. They don't want to be managers. I paid my people. I was the CEO for 20 years. I paid myself the most money one year when I sold to Xerox. Those guys would rather be bankers or analysts or traders, and they're happier there. They don't want to be managers, most of them. There are very few of us that are managers, and they do take the credit. Every year, the biggest problem I had was paying people, trying to convince them what they really weren't worth, $10 million, try to prove to them that, I have to run a business and I got to pay you a certain amount, this other guy a certain amount. So those egos you had to contain. It was extremely difficult. But, most people didn't have the interest. And people marveled at me. They said, why are you doing this? You don't really create, you're a manager. We don't want managers. We want people to produce business. And I did produce some business too, but that was they're very different. There were one manager for every almost 100 of those other kind of characters. And they do make more money. They make more money and they're more prestigious. In fact, I, as a manager, had another tenet, which was basically to live happy, was to live hidden. I stayed out of the press. I had no public image whatsoever. In fact, this whole experience I'm going through now is really fun for me because I've never done it before. Lou Dobbs called me up and said, you sold the company, I'd like to have you on television. I said, no. I said, how about tomorrow? He says, old news. And I never got on television after selling the company. And the newspaper would call me and say, what do you think about the market? I would never talk to them because I didn't want the public image. And the public image basically would get in contrast with some of my stars, my analysts and my bankers. I gave them the privilege. Those are kind of management things coming out of MBA. MBAs coming out, they really want to be stars. And for me, I got much bigger kick out of running a show, putting people together. God excited me to watch starting a company. Guy would come to me and say, I have an idea. It's okay. Here's a telephone. Here's a desk. Here's some money. Go and do it. And I had a lot of fun with that. And that's what I really enjoyed. So finding my passion. Now, I don't disagree with the banker that has like Steve Schwarzman. There's a huge, desire to be a great banker. God bless him. You put these people together. So that's sort of the little bit of the secret. Most MBAs, MBAs that go into Wall Street are not really interested that much in management. And it's very tough because you're dealing with people that are very smart all the time. The difference between manufacturing and Wall Street is you really have to, it's a collaborative experience, Being a manufacturer, you can be the guy, you run the company, you own 100% of the stock and so on. In Wall Street, you've got to spread out. Like when I sold the company, I bought it back from Xerox. It's in the case at Wall Street. How did you divide the stock up? And I basically took the top 20 guys and I said, I'm going to give you 80% of the stock, break it up, include me. And they gave me about 17%. They gave themselves. And so each of the 19 people would come in and they'd all say, well, I didn't get enough. And I said, well, that's what your partners gave you. And by the way, I'm going to give you another 0.5% of mine. So I went from 17 down to 9.5 by doing that. Of course, I gained the total, backing, but the other 19 guys, most of them, I didn't give them all 0.5%, but I gave a lot of them a little more than they were given by their partners. It was I put a matrix together and I had each person evaluate the other 19 guys. It was really fun. And gals, a couple gals in there too. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Thank you. And by the way, the other thing you have to do besides wanting people to do better than they think they can, you must have a strategy and it must be dynamic. You've got to say what's next. And I used to tell people at Furman Selz, it's like a lily pad. We're going to jump from lily pads to lily pad. As soon as we all get on a little pad, it's going to start to sink. You got to move to the next one. If you don't keep moving, you're going to be dead. And even though, I had the wind at my back from 83 to 2000, stock market went up 10 times, about 75% of my size firms went out of business or got merged out. So we didn't get merged out until 1997. But you have to have a strategy. It's culture, strategy, people, evaluation. You got to keep them. And it's evaluation. I had a meeting. 5 of us had a meeting once every Monday afternoon. I believed in that. That's organized. But once a month, we had the 13, at the end, 13 division heads, and then a bunch of ancillary people like the CFO and people met once a month and went over the numbers. And anybody that had bad numbers, we tried to help. It was like a Quaker meeting, Everybody's in it because everybody owns stock. That was another one of my pieces of magic, which everybody owns stock. I had 200 shareholders out of 800 employees at the end. So I didn't have to come to work. I mean, they were pulling a rock up the hill in the morning before I got there. So anyway, that's sort of my answer. But you have to have strategy. You just can't be nice to people and help them. You have to have basically a strategy that you understand your market and you know exactly where you're going. So the reason you don't want that is because then you can change direction. If you don't know where you're going, the old story, any road will take you there.
So speaking of strategy and timing, what was the thinking selling Furman Selz to Xerox? You wouldn't ordinarily think of that. And then what was around timing, the decision to buy it back? How did you process all of that?
First of all, luck. You see in my book, skill is important, but luck is essential. I sold that, got my check on October the 1st, 1987, 3 weeks before the crash. The reason we sold out is basically, I've been there 5 years, and we went from 20 million to 75 million. And I was getting very bearish on the world. I was getting very nervous on the S&L industry, and I was very nervous on the basic, the whole financial industry. As you know, 88, 89, and 90 had a crash in real estate, and I couldn't have sold the firm. But just Xerox came along, and there was a great name, and they basically said to me, we'll pay you 3 times book, which was at the time one of the highest prices ever paid for a company. David Kearns graduated from the University of Rochester, and he was the CEO, and just absolutely charming, first-rate human being. So they pay me 3 times book. For the first time in my life, I had real money. I mean, I got 10 million out of that. Thinking, when I graduated business school, I had a negative net worth. And here, somebody giving me $10 million, my God, that was the greatest thing in the world. Plus the fact, the 2 of my partners, basically owned a little more stock than I did. They were in favor of it. And Xerox was a really high quality operation. I could never figure out why they were going to do it. I have to tell a funny story. Toward the end, I did the deal by myself. Didn't even bring my 2 partners, Furman and Selz, in. So, but the guy who bought it, the vice chairman came in, he said, I want to meet the 2 founders. So I got in there, and Bernard, who will ask any question to anybody after about an hour of conversation, he turns to this guy and says, why the hell would you buy us? And so I kicked him under the table, got 5 reasons, and got my friend Bernard out of there. He's one of the worst people in the world, one of the best money managers anyone has ever come across. He had a record of 29 years of outstanding performance. But anyway, those are the main reasons. I was bearish. I always believed if you can get a price for your company that looks like you've worked for the next 5 years, if they'll pay you what you might get to in 5 years, then I would sell the company. I did the same thing to ING in 1997. But Xerox and Xerox, basically, one of my classmates, one of my Harvard Business School classmates, was on the board, and I think he voted against it. but it got pushed through, and we stepped. But toward the they realized they had made a mistake. They wanted to buy us because McKinsey had convinced them that the cooperative business was going to go out of business someday. This was a way of building a financial services company that was basically compatible with the credit company they had for the Xerox copy machines. So it's an interesting story. And they were really wonderful people. And also the deal they gave me was a very good one. They gave me a percentage of the profits, and they left us alone. So, they promised me to leave me alone. So everything sort of fit together, and I figured, what the hell? Couldn't go too far wrong. And also, Xerox was located on the bagel run on Saturday morning. My house was in Connecticut, and on the way to get bagels on Saturday morning, I went right past Xerox. So when they wanted to see me, I just got up a little bit later and showed up at their office the next morning. Long story, sorry.
No, thank you. Kelly, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I have a question related to that. So in your book, you talk about the 4 Ps: passion, principles, partners, and plans. I wanted to hear a little bit about planning, and this is related to career, I think mostly is what you're referring to. And are you bearish right now how the market is, and how would being bearish currently factor into a plan?
No, when I was a strategist, that's I had the most fun for 25 plus 30 years, running around telling people what was going to happen next in the market. During periods like this, I'd always end my speeches with, the world doesn't come to an end very often. So, and especially in America, we always seem to get out of that. But, I believe that periods like this offer enormous opportunity. In fact, I think because I'm a value investor, I'm more excited about now than I would be when things are getting too hot. So that factors into my planning. When I see periods like this, I'm looking around, going back to Bernard Baruch when he, 1933, looking for $1 stocks. In 2008 and the first 2 months of 2009, I bought a series of $1 stocks. Just one, that's what he did. And all those $1 stocks went to at least 2 in 2009. That's in my book. I unfortunately closed my hedge fund, become the chairman of the board of trustees at Rochester, which is another whole story. Maybe I might have made a mistake because I might have done really, I did really well in the crash, and I would have done well in 2009. But these are chances of opportunity. I'm finding companies now, again, selling at cash, that have very good opportunities. I'm finding managers that are down 30, 40, 50%, that are really good managers. And so that's part of your plan. And you have to recognize in every business there's a cycle. And when you can, that's why I put the S curve in my book, because I think that basically in the next book, it's actually more prominent, is that I tell people, first of all, recognize no matter what you're in, there's an S curve. And the S curve will talk to you. The bottom, it'll tell you all the black stuff that's going on. If you recognize that that's the bottom, good. The top, it'll tell you, this is the future, this is different, it'll go on forever. And so that this is a situation, and you basically look at that and everything. And I tell people to try to look what part of the S curve you're in. At the bottom, at the top, side, where are you? And in the case of planning, it's just recognizing that and then taking advantage of that particular experience. So if you recognize it's the top, you should become a little more conservative. And then you can't ever really judge completely. The bottom, you get a little more aggressive. And it's not a glacial change, but it's a slow change. And then occasionally you'll get an epiphany where, in 2009, the first 2 months, I just saw the whole thing very clearly. And I've always got a pretty good tummy for bear markets. Because my father got crushed in 29, I've always been too conservative. I got conservative in the middle of 2021 when people started buying $100 million paintings and $200 million apartments. I used to have a list of all kinds of anecdotal stuff that happens during bull markets. And last year 2021 had all the bells went off. That was my strategy piece. I write strategy piece just for fun now, but my was all the bells have gone off. Now my strategy piece is called the 11 Black Swans. Does that answer your question, Cal? It is. And I think, by the way, the most important thing you can do is start writing stuff down.
Right.
When I wrote down my all the bells were going off, I realized I was there. I just looked, I said, oh my God, they've all gone off. Everything I've ever looked at, crazy people buying apartments, art going crazy, crypto, every cycle has in 99, they had the E-stocks, in 7, they had, the housing stuff. Houses were never going to go down. Now you had crypto. I would say I've tried 3 or 4 times to understand it. You've lost $2 trillion in crypto. You know that Lunar that went bankrupt is bigger than Lehman Brothers. And the market's been very resilient, although it's down 30%. So the planning part is basically try to understand where you are in whatever cycle you're in and try to take advantage of that or to get out of the way. My son, who's an intuitor, my middle son, who's in the real estate business, has sold everything. And he's been dead right now. He sold it last year. He said, Dad, I got nothing left. He's now back being an architect.
I have a follow-up question to that. In navigating that, it's all the beginning process is selection of information sources and then absorption of that information, and then you process from there and so on. So how did you select what information to get, and then how did you so what kind of information to get, and then select the source?
It's mostly people. I in my book I talk about the 4 P's. One of them is partners. Surround yourself. I've only been as good as the people I surrounded myself with. I was a little above average student. I didn't get good grades in college, but I did graduate from distinction, Harvard Business School. I would have been a Baker Scholar if I didn't live off campus. I blame my roommate for that forever, moving me off campus my second year. So I graduated distinction in the top 10. So I had some brains, but you're only good as the people you surround yourself with. And so selecting those people for what they know and then developing a capability. For example, let me do something to give you a silly example. I belong to 4 investment clubs, 2 of which I formed back in the 60s. And we meet once a month. So this afternoon, I talked to 12 very bright people who gave me ideas about short and long certain stocks. Now I will sift through those and use my own screen, which I've developed over time, that are good for me. Some guy will come in and say, this is a fantastic company. It's going at 50% a year. It's selling at 100 times earnings. No good for me. Guy comes in and says, this is selling at book value. Nobody understands it's going to grow for the next 10 years at 10% a year, and it's selling at 6 times earnings, I get excited because I have my own screen now. So first of all, people, surround yourself with people, then build who you are. Are you a growth guy? Are you a value guy? And what kind of information do you want? And then I have services. I've read something called 13D for 20 years. I've read something called Loophole for 20 years. Fact is, when I was running the endowment at the University of Rochester, I had all of the team read a series of documents because you can't read too much. You will be buried in stuff. But certain things you can read, like Loophole, he basically does a great job on the history of the market. Okay, this guy 13D, he's got great insights onto lots of different things. So I read him, and then I'll read a couple of people who I trust. This fellow John Malden, he has Saturday mornings free. He writes very, very well, and he's been very good over. I've read him almost forever. So, but you got to strain that out, and then every once in a while you add somebody new. Every once in a while maybe you drop somebody. But it's really, in many respects, it's all people, and it's input. But you have to decide while you're doing this early on, you got to develop who you are, because you will do better if you understand when the stuff comes in. Some stuff you don't have to look at because it's not you. No matter how fast the company grows, if it's expensive, I'm not interested. No matter how sexy the product is, I'm not interested. Give me something that's that's selling, that's undiscovered. Maybe it's a new idea that's still selling cheap. I'll be interested in that. So sort out that sort of thing. Or in the case of how much risk do you want to take? Some people are fabulous in taking enormous risk, like they'll buy leveraged ETFs. I won't touch a leveraged ETF. I just don't have. You don't need that. I mean, I don't need that kind of thing. Also, leverage in general. I mean, and I borrowed money to buy my first house, but as quick as I get out of debt, I got it. My father was leveraged 9 to 1. That's why he blew up. That's what you did in 1929. You bought RCA stock, you leveraged it 9 to 1, and you were a millionaire in no time. Because it went up, 400%. But in my case, I have never had any leverage. So again, early on, this 18 to 25-year-old, or when you get out of business school, you start to make a certain list of who you are. One is no leverage yet, don't borrow money. That's a bad idea. And so occasionally I'll go on margin. When I get comfortable, or in a particular investment, I might go on margin. One reason I'm not enthusiastic about bonds, because in order to make money in bonds, you really have to be on leverage, or currencies. I mean, I really enjoy playing currencies. I get a kick out. I don't do it because you have to go on margin. Because they move 5%, it's a big deal. I make 5% of money. Maybe you make 10% if you're really lucky, or some crazy year like this year. But usually you got to go on margin to buy currency, and it fluctuates a lot. So that's not my game. So you got to find out what your game is. The same thing in companies. Some people could work for Glucksman, the most miserable manager in the world, if he's smart enough. There's certain hedge fund guys that are just so smart, but they're awful. But people can work for them. Like my daughter won't work for anybody who's not nice. That's her thing. She says, "I'm not doing that. I don't want to work for bad people." So these are characteristics. What you have to do, and I break life into 4 parts: self, family, work, and community, which is giving back. That self part has got to be solved as much as you can, although it will change over time. Those early 18 to 25 years, you got to really, so your screen gets to be pretty damn fine. So when the information comes in, you really can digest it. But it is surrounding yourself with the right people. That's number one. And then selecting some services over time, and then saying, if this is next, how am I going to follow what's next? Then there's always a new service that can come in. In my time, I followed some technical services that evolved during particular market periods that were better than others.
Great, thanks.
Hope that helped.
We're almost out of time, but I have one last question. So Ed, I read in your book that you called yourself Mr. Involved, and I could tell that you did so much earlier in your career. And I was curious, did that help you professionally? Did you slow down being involved when you had young children? You're still very involved in a lot, which is very impressive. How has it really shaped your career and your path?
What, that with the early style?
Being involved at different stages early on, when you had a young family, and even now.
No, that's why I say this. That's why I pitched this whole idea of the 8 words: self, family, work, and community giving back, and then the 4 Ps. You have to put those 4 Ps in each of those buckets of life. You have to recognize that life, balance is bull. I mean, you're always juggling everything. You're juggling self, family, work, and business. When you work for Lehman Brothers, in order to be successful, you must focus. When you focus on work, then your family loses a little focus. And you have to go back immediately. You have to say, what am I going to do with my family in order to make sure I don't lose complete control of that? So you take certain kinds of vacations. I took vacations where definitely the kids and I would be together. I sell this to people. If you want to go on a vacation, go on a boat in the Caribbean, take a little trimaran or a catamaran, because at the end of the evening, you and your family are stuck. You have to talk. So that helped me a lot. But dividing the world up like that, it came to a certain point in my life where I was going to get rid of work, lose the focus on work, and focus on community giving back. And that has been more satisfaction than anything. University of Rochester, giving scholarships and helping that university and change and grow was the greatest satisfaction I've had. And the golf course and the community in Nantucket is also. But all these things, is basically looking at your life and trying to balance them. And sometimes you need to go back and really spend, time with your family. And I always tell people who are young and married, never go more than a couple months without spending time with your spouse, because you're changing and she's changing more, because she has a family, she has children, and so on. If you lose track of that, you're in trouble. And then what happens basically, if you're successful in business and you're not successful in family, the whole thing is not worth it, because family is what's left over after all is said and done. And so you must spend the time, and we don't spend enough time on it. And family is complicated. It really is, because, kids don't have the same experience you do. How can I ask my kids to be like me when my daughter used to tell everybody that the tennis court and swimming pool belonged to the next door neighbors? She just wouldn't have it. And today is the same way. She wants to fly. We have a plane. She'll fly commercial because she really wants to live that kind of life. And so it's very, very difficult in that respect. But that's what shaped my life, is I try to understand that you're always going to get a lot of balance, but try to move back toward balance. When people ask me, what advice do you give executives? It's to recognize there are 4 parts of life and try to keep in balance when you know you're always going to be out of balance. And if you find you're way out of balance, try to move back, just simple things. I mean, I tell people that when they're working really hard, at least every couple of months, send your spouse flowers or your husband a note and say, hey, just because, don't not be an anniversary or birthday, things like that, little things like that. And, Barbara and I do that. We have date nights still. And my daughter has date nights, once a week, go out and just be alone, because you really want to be alone. I mean, that's very important. Young marrieds, they say, what should I do? Take a car trip. 4 or 5 days in the car with somebody, you discuss everything. It's really wonderful. I don't know if that answered your question, Kelly. It was a good question.
Thank you.
It's a little bit. I should tell one story that you didn't come up with, which is about my mother.
Mm-hmm.
After 57 years, and we were home. My father died when I was 36. 24 years later, he left a suitcase, which I went into, and it brought back bad memories, so I just stuffed it away in a closet. On a rainy day when I was 60, my wife said, I'm throwing this suitcase away if you don't look in it. So I decided, okay, it's a rainy day, I'll look in it. And I came across a package of letters. My father had saved every letter that I wrote him that I didn't recognize. And I opened it up, and sure enough, I found out my mother didn't die, that they gotten divorced. And she, we didn't know where she was, but she didn't die. So I hired a private detective. And the only last place that I knew that she was St. Louis, using the Hajim name, which is only those 5 letters were made up by the customs, so there's nobody else. They found her, and they called us up and said, we found her. Barbara and I spent 30 to 60 days. Figure we want to bring this awful woman into our life. We were 2, 3 children. I had a good job, we're good in the community. Everything was fine. Why do I want to bring in this strange person who my father said was not a good person? We decided we would do it. And so I wrote her a letter. So I think I'm your son. If you want to get together, call me. She did. We flew out to see her, and she turned out to be a wonderful lady. And I learned who I really was, because I thought maybe I was my father. I was actually probably, I think, I look back on it, less than 50% my father. My mother was a character. She, first of all, talked fast, which nobody in St. Louis talks fast. She leaned over like I do, which I shouldn't. My wife keeps telling me to stand up straight. And she rhymed. She would go to a party and rhyme, and she would memorize the rhyme. So I got 12 years out of her. She died when she was 93. And she was, my father, felt but didn't think much. And she thought and didn't feel as much. That's why she gave me up. But she was sensible. You know, she was very sensible. In fact, she didn't get emotional when she saw me until a couple hours later. Even then, she didn't get very emotional. She was very sensible about everything. And that's, you know, part of my life. I've been a fairly sensible guy, and I didn't know where it came from because my father was very hot-tempered and very impulsive and so on. And, you know, I had that, a little bit of that, of course. But so that was an interesting experience. And then she became, you know, she would always say to me, well, you know, I'm not really your mother. But if I didn't call her on Sunday, the next week she would say, long time between drinks of water, you know, a little bit of guilt. Anyway, sorry to bring that up, but it's a funny part of my life story that, you know, most people don't have, you know, and we had a lot of fun with her. And she became one of a trio of, Barbara's mother was 98 when she died. Barbara's aunt was 95, and my mother was 93. They were three musketeers for about 10 years.
No,
That's
thank you
amazing.
for sharing that, and thank you for the time. And certainly, God bless you. You're fortunate
Well,
to have had those years with your
Thank you,
mom.
Joe. It's always a lot of fun talking to Harvard Business School people because we have shared experience.
Yeah.
And we spent 2 years mouth-to-mouth combat. We know what the real fun is there in the business school. And I just love business school people. And I'm so glad my daughter went to business school.
Well, thank you so much, Ed.
Thank you.
Really, thank you
Yeah,
guys.
thanks so much.
Good luck.
Ed,
And
thank you so much.
Trade. May the force be with you. Bye.
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 Thank you.
Bye.
Take